So in this video, I want to talk about some additional terminology. We'll get into some phraseology and linguistics, but essentially moving down the same path from the first video. So we're going to define some things, but I also want to expand to take a look at some typical errors that people make when they're reasoning, some of them on accident, some of them on purpose. And we can begin to take a look at the ways in which arguments go awry so that you can arm yourself with the ability to start seeing these things. And the first one is correlation and causation. So let's get that out of the way and talk about what it means. You hear the phrase often, correlation is not causation. What does that mean? Suppose you were to examine two objects and you noticed that when you saw changes in one object, you would see changes in the second object. So you might draw the conclusion from that object A changing causes the change in object B. The problem is there may be a third item that is causing the change to happen in both things simultaneously. For example, suppose I own a convenience store and I notice around June that the sales of ice cream begin to spike. And almost at the same time, the sale of sunglasses begins to spike. So I could draw the conclusion, well, when I sell more ice cream and those sales increase, that causes the sale of sunglasses to increase. And we know that that's false because what is really occurring, well, it's summertime. And so either the sun or the summertime, that is the cause of both sales of ice cream and sunglasses increasing. In other words, one is not causing the other. They are both responding to some third source. That's a correlation. There's a correlation between the sun and the sales of ice cream and the sales of sunglasses. Causation is different. Causation means that one object truly is causing the other object to change in some way. That would be cause. So, for example, if I were to run on the treadmill vigorously, eventually I would begin to slim down. And so I could say, well, vigorous exercise causes the body to burn more calories. Now, that would be true. We could test it in a laboratory. We could apply the scientific method to that, and we could determine that that's true. Vigorous exercise is the cause of burning more calories. So that's the distinction between correlation and causation. Next is a fairly simple distinction, but it's well worth talking about. It's regarding misrepresentation, or as we might refer to them, lies, and the people who tell them, liars. So there are basically two ways that this happens. There are lies by omission, and there are lies by commission. In lies by omission, this occurs when I simply left some information out. So suppose I published a study and I wasn't happy with the results, and so I did not include the data that I got from a set of 1/3 of the people that I had polled. So I left that information out. I turned in the study because leaving that information out gave me the conclusion that I wanted. Now, lying by commission would be adding information. So let's say I do the study. I didn't quite get the hypothesis that I was hoping for, and so I make up the results of dozens of more people who were never interviewed. They're totally made up, and I add a bunch of false data and turn that in because it supports my hypotheses. I added information, so that's lying by commission. So lying by omission, leaving it out, lying by commission, adding stuff in. The next thing that I want to talk about is experts who speak outside of their field. So we would be right to credit people with their accomplishments when they're in the field of expertise to which they succeeded. In other words, a race car driver would be someone who could speak to automobile handling, the nuances of driving at very dangerous speeds. He's an expert there. Now, just because he's an expert in race car driving doesn't mean that he would have an adequate knowledge set to be able to speak to whether or not God exists. I'm giving you dramatic examples to make them obvious, but sometimes these are not so clear. We often see this in business. For example, Mark Twain, who one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest American author of all time, wildly successful at it, but it did not enhance his ability to do well in business by any means. So that would be a good example of an expert having an expertise in the field and it not translating into a different field. Be very careful how you credit experts. If they're speaking in their field, then they probably deserve credit, not always. But oftentimes we hear experts who are speaking outside of their field. Now, just to continue on with terminology a little bit, we have actual science, and then we have what people sometimes refer to as the science. So, well, the science says, and typically what that means is they're defaulting to some authoritarian view on what science is supposed to mean or what you should understand science to mean. And the difference is this: if you want to know what science tells us, then you will go and look at the studies that were done in laboratories by experts. You'll have to analyze data sets and come to the conclusion, and whatever that tells you, that's the scientific method. And when we talk about the science, this is generally made as a reference during conversation, and it's really a cudgel, which means it's thrown out there to sort of trip the opponent up, to give my opponent the sense that I know more than I'm talking about because I'm referencing the science. Well, my referencing the science doesn't add anything to the argument. It really just sort of misdirects for a moment, and it leans on your politeness. The move is that you're supposed to respond by, well, maybe I shouldn't question that. He seems to know what he's talking about there. He made a reference to the science. And so that's a very important distinction to keep in mind. Science requires the application of the scientific method, analysis of data sets, and independent conclusions. Speaking of science, another error that occurs is when you have people who take terminology that sounds like it's specific to some field of scientific study, and they apply that to words that they want to make use of. So, for example, we have a whole new body of phobias out there. It seems to be increasing all the time. I don't know where it began, but homophobia, there's Islamophobia, there's transphobia, there's this phobia and that phobia, and they sound like they come right out of psychology, as though, well, these are DSM catalog defined phobias, and they're not. People just took the term phobia, which became well known, and then they attach it to the subject they're talking about. And they do that because it's a way of discrediting their opponent. Oh, well, you don't agree with me? It's because you're transphobic, which basically means that you could have no good argument. You are simply arguing from a place of bias. You have a fear of this thing. And so it kind of encourages the audience to disregard what you're saying and just suppose that you have some sort of mental condition that prevents you from being able to think about the issue clearly. So you're simply phobic of whatever this topic is. That's the move. Another move that's kind of similar to that is moralizing positions. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of this in politics right now. And the move here is when you take a position and you canonize it. In other words, you assert that this position is so clearly correct and obviously right that there could be no opposition to it. So, this kind of thinking is something that you might find if you went to a church somewhere. People are there, and they're there to kind of repeat the axioms and principles that come from whatever their religion is, and they're not there to challenge them. Now that's okay. The religion is its own thing. I don't want anyone to think I'm picking on religion here, but when you take other political positions, such as, well, we ought to reorder society in this way, or we ought to do this for this group of people or that group of people, or this would be a way that we ought to invest money, or this is how we should tax people, and you begin moralizing those positions, what you basically do is you lift these positions to axiom status, whereby anyone who even disagreed, if you even thought about disagreeing with this obviously correct, obviously morally right position, then you would be wrong. And so it's a direction to the audience to not even listen to anything that you have to say in objection, because the position of yours is so righteous that no possible challenge to it could exist. That's what happens when you moralize positions. And when you moralize positions, if you can get enough of the audience to go along with that and suppose that that's also true, that's a very, very dangerous way to think and to cause others to think. So the moralized positions would be perfectly well suited if you found them in a church. Be very careful when you come across moralized positions. There really should be none in the public arena for ordinary debate. Bridging off moralized positions just a little bit here, it would be worth it to make note of the fact that you will see emotion codified into language. And I'll give you some examples of this, 3 in a row: hate speech, hate groups, hate crimes. Yes, it's true that people say things to each other out of hate. Yes, it's true that there are groups of people who agree on things that they hate. And yes, I think almost all crime, certainly if it's against another individual and it's done intentionally, could be described as a hate crime. I'm not sure why we would need a new category of crimes. In murder, we have first, second, and third degree, and then it becomes homicide and manslaughter, and gradations less and less. And so now we are compelled to sort of add this new category of hate crime. Well, every crime is a hate crime. If you took someone's life because you hated who they were as a person, you really do a lot of disrespect to people who suppose an old person was mugged in the street for their purse and left for dead. But the person who was killed for their identity instead of their purse is now guilty of a worse crime. So if my grandmother was a victim of mugging, now the person who did that is not going to be punished as severely as someone who did it, let's say because they didn't like old people, which is considered a hate crime. It doesn't matter to me. I've lost a person. It's the exact same net result for me and for my grandmother. And so that's a little bit of moralizing in there as well. But to take this emotionally charged language, hate speech, hate groups, hate crimes, look at how it's being exported into the broader language in the country. It's a very dangerous thing, and so you should be on the lookout for that. You should be able to eliminate those kinds of things immediately. Know them, understand what it is, what the motivation is behind it, and that it is simply a cudgel. Very similar to the emotional codification of language would be the phenomena called newspeak. Now, newspeak is essentially an old Soviet concept whereby they just made up new words to mean new things. And this is sort of attached to a broader theory that's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, newspeak includes any type of phraseology that is brand new. So the notion of microaggressions. This didn't exist before, and so it's designed to define something in a new way so that you believe that you should make room for it. Oh, well, it's a new term. I'm learning this new term. You take for granted whether or not it's actually a real thing, and that's the trick there, or the move. And so microaggressions, you could look at the new genders and the definitions and stratification of gender, whichever side you are on in that public debate will say. It doesn't matter. We're simply referring to the phenomena that is apparent to us, and that is true, that this is a relatively new move. So if you look at Canada, for example, where they are wanting to insert new gender pronouns that are just basically made up in universities or other places where you find activists who want to impose language on the public. And so we don't really hear a lot of talk about this in the United States, but I will go ahead and post a small chart so that you can all see what they are and appreciate the differences. These are completely made up terms. They're totally brand new. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't correspond to something legitimate. But the move that they are trying to make here, those who come up with these new terms, is they would like you to believe that since you had not heard of this term before, they just want you to take for granted whether or not the thing that it refers to is actually real. That's the move. Oh, I heard a new word. Gee, I better memorize it and think about what it means and add that definition to my lexicon. No, not necessarily. Stop and think about it. Maybe it does refer to something, maybe it doesn't. It's okay to think about it for a minute and decide whether or not you want to download that new word or those new phrases and begin using them. Be on the lookout for those. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which I mentioned earlier, is basically this. It says the words in the language that you use determine how you see the world. And we generally have an intuitive sense that the opposite is true, right? No, I have all these words and terms in my lexicon, and I will draw on those when I need to name something or when I need to identify something in the world. Well, the opposite is sort of correct. What Sapir-Whorf hypothesis asserts is that those words that you have available to you, the way that they have been defined, that will determine the way that you see the world. And the example I have for you is a little abstract, but for those of you who speak Spanish or some other second language, you may have had the experience where someone asked you, hey, how do you say this in Spanish? And maybe it was a word or a term or a phrase where you had to say, we don't really have a word for that. Or that's not quite how we don't think about it that way, or we don't see it that way, and then end up describing it that way. That's kind of an example of validating, in a sense, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So there is some truth to that the words that you have available to you and the way that they're defined will ultimately determine how you are seeing the world. They may limit it, they may change it, they may give a different perspective. There is a significant amount of truth to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, I would say, in context. I think that it's true that if you begin changing your language, then you can really see clearly that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is kind of validated in that specific exercise. So if I have words and I'm using them to refer to one thing, suppose gender, for example. I only have 2 different words for gender in my lexicon, unless it's plural. And so now if I throw those out and I add some new words, well, yes, that is what enables me to begin seeing the world differently. The world didn't actually change, but the way that I see it did because of the new terminology that I've picked up. That is Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in action. Type 1 and type 2 errors are typically mistakes that we hear about in psychology. What they involve is either accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis. So whatever your hypothesis is, the null is simply the negation of that. It's the opposite of that. So in a type 1 error, I'm seeing a difference where there is none. And so I'm rejecting the null hypothesis. I'm wanting to see something, and so I reject that, and I shouldn't have. That is a type 1 error. You rejected the null hypothesis. In a type 2 error, this is when I accept the null for whatever reason. I have some bias or inability to see the data sets correctly. That is a type 2 error. I have accepted the null hypothesis and undercut my argument and committed the type 2 error. Alpha and beta errors, these are also referred to on occasion. So that's a little bit about those. And what I wanted to close with here is just a closer look at some phraseology and language. For example, the notion of a patriarchal society. Well, if I begin speaking to you and I talk about the patriarchy, then that's presuming, and it's asking you to validate my presumption by presuming it yourself, that we are talking about the patriarchy. So we've already established that that's there without even having a conversation about it. So there's a big difference between beginning a sentence talking about the patriarchy versus beginning a sentence talking about my observation of a broad social order with patriarchal characteristics. Now that's something that we could have a conversation about. You have to understand, when you hear that kind of claim, built into it is the assumption that there already is a patriarchy. And so now you're on the ropes to try to dismiss that notion when it hasn't, in fact, been established. What I'm saying is there's a huge difference between beginning a sentence with the patriarchy is characterized by this, this, and this. That's not really the same as saying, well, in my view, I can see some elements in society that make me suspicious of a broader social order with patriarchal characteristics. Okay, we could have a discussion about the second thing, that patriarchal characteristics may or may not be there. You can point to what they are. We can have debate about them and try to determine whether or not they're legitimate observations. But if you begin a sentence with, well, we're talking about the patriarchy, so then you're really imposing validation of that term on me. And there's no reason that anyone should accept that. So be very careful in those nuances of language when you're examining arguments. All right, that's just a little bit of discussion about many, many different ways that people will use and abuse linguistics to try and advance their arguments or discredit their opponents. And so in the next video, we'll go a step further and we'll start to take a look at some deliberate misuse, misnaming things, intentional confusion, and the manipulation of statistics, which is a really, really difficult thing to keep track of. But fortunately, you don't have to do a ton of training to be able to see some of the basic moves that people make to try to lead you astray. And so we'll talk about that in the next one. I'll catch up with you next time.